Why avoidants friendzone you even when they love you sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after they've spent months trying to decode somebody who made them feel chosen in private and dismissed in public, because that's the part nobody talks about enough. It's not the coldness that hurts the most. It's the warmth. It's the way they look at you when you're about to leave, the way they remember tiny details nobody else notices, the way they text you first at night but disappear emotionally the moment things start feeling too real. One day it feels like you're watching the beginning of something undeniable, and the next day they hit you with, "I just don't want to ruin the friendship," and suddenly your brain starts replaying every conversation like security footage, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But here's the brutal truth most people misunderstand about avoidance. Sometimes the friend zone is not built because there are no feelings. Sometimes it's built because the feelings are too intense to feel safe. And if you've ever been emotionally trapped between "they clearly care" and "why won't they choose me," then this video is probably going to hit harder than you expect. So before we go deeper into the psychology behind all this, take 2 seconds to subscribe, because this channel is basically becoming a survival guide for anyone trying to understand avoidant attachment without losing their sanity in the process. The confusing part about avoidance is that they rarely enter your life like somebody emotionally unavailable. In fact, at first they can feel unusually present, easy to talk to, funny, deep, comfortable. It almost feels like they skipped the awkward stage and somehow landed straight in emotional intimacy. You start having conversations that feel too personal for just friends. Hours disappear without effort. They become part of your routine without even announcing themselves. They start sharing pieces of themselves slowly, carefully, but enough to make you feel trusted. And because human beings naturally associate emotional closeness with romantic progression, you assume the connection is moving somewhere. That's where the confusion begins. Because with avoidance, emotional closeness and romantic commitment are not automatically connected in their mind the way they are for most people. Someone can become emotionally important to them while still triggering fear the moment the relationship starts carrying romantic weight. So what happens? Their behavior says intimacy, but their words create distance. They flirt, then retreat. They rely on you emotionally, then remind you you're such a good friend. They create moments that feel romantic and then suddenly act strangely detached after those moments become too emotionally charged. And the reason this becomes so psychologically exhausting is because inconsistency creates obsession. The human brain can handle rejection easier than ambiguity, but avoidants often create a constant emotional gray area where you never fully know whether you're loved, wanted, or slowly being kept at arm's length. That uncertainty keeps people emotionally hooked far longer than clarity ever would. What many people fail to realize is that friendship feels safer to avoidance than romance does. Friendship has space in it. Friendship feels lower pressure. Friendship allows emotional connection without the terrifying expectations that come with commitment. The second something becomes officially romantic, avoidants subconsciously start feeling responsibilities they don't know how to carry. Now, there are expectations for consistency, vulnerability, reassurance, future planning, emotional availability. And for someone wired to associate closeness with pressure or loss of freedom, romance can start feeling emotionally claustrophobic even when the feelings are genuine. That's why an avoidant can spend months emotionally attached to someone while still resisting labels. It's not always manipulation in the calculated sense people imagine. A lot of the time it's emotional self-protection operating in the background without conscious awareness. They feel safer loving you from a distance where they can still control the intensity. Because once the relationship becomes real, now there's something to lose. Now vulnerability becomes unavoidable. Now abandonment becomes possible. And underneath many avoidance is a nervous system that learned long ago that needing people too deeply is dangerous. So they stay in the friend dynamic because friendship lets them experience closeness while still preserving an exit door emotionally. And the heartbreaking part is that they often do not realize how painful this contradiction feels for the other person. They think they're avoiding chaos, but what they create instead is emotional limbo. What makes this even more painful is that avoidance can absolutely love someone without feeling emotionally ready for them. That's the part people struggle to accept because we grow up believing love naturally creates commitment, but attachment wounds don't work that way. Someone can deeply care about you and still feel overwhelmed by what being with you emotionally requires from them. In fact, the stronger the feelings become, the more fear can start surfacing internally. Because deeper love means deeper vulnerability, deeper dependency, deeper potential loss. And avoidants are often experts at functioning when emotions stay manageable, but not when emotions become consuming. So instead of moving closer when feelings intensify, they unconsciously create distance. Sometimes that distance becomes the friend zone. They convince themselves it's the safe option. They tell themselves they don't want to ruin the connection. They say the timing feels wrong. They focus on practical excuses. But underneath all those rationalizations is usually fear. Fear that they won't be enough emotionally. Fear that they'll disappoint you. Fear that intimacy will slowly suffocate them. Fear that once you truly know them, you'll eventually leave anyway. And because avoidants struggle to communicate vulnerability directly, these fears rarely come out honestly. Instead, they come out sideways through mixed signals, hesitation, emotional withdrawal, and confusing relationship labels that never fully match the intensity of the connection itself. One of the biggest signs you're dealing with this dynamic is how avoidants often become the warmest right before they pull away. Right when things finally start feeling mutual, something shifts. Maybe the conversations became too intimate, maybe physical closeness increased. Maybe you started acting more like a couple naturally. Whatever triggered it, their nervous system suddenly interprets the growing intimacy as danger instead of comfort. And that's when the emotional temperature changes overnight. They become harder to read, responses slow down, energy changes. They start emphasizing friendship again after acting romantic for weeks. Sometimes they even become weirdly formal or emotionally distant immediately after moments of closeness. And if you don't understand avoidant attachment, this behavior feels unbelievably personal. You assume you did something wrong, but internally avoidants are often fighting a silent war between attachment and self-protection. One side wants connection desperately, the other side fears losing emotional control inside that connection, so they pull back to regulate themselves. The tragedy is that this withdrawal usually hurts the very person they feel safest with, and because avoidants rarely explain what's happening internally, the other person is left carrying confusion, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion alone. That's why people stuck in avoidant friend zone dynamics often feel addicted to trying to earn certainty. They keep chasing the version of the avoidant that appeared during moments of closeness, hoping consistency will eventually return. But until the avoidant learns how to tolerate intimacy without perceiving it as a threat, the cycle keeps repeating itself in different forms. What confuses people even more is that avoidants are often capable of emotional intimacy long before they are capable of romantic intimacy, and those two things are not the same no matter how similar they look on the surface. Emotional intimacy is the late-night conversation, the vulnerable confession, the feeling of being understood by someone in a way that almost feels addictive. Avoidants can sometimes live in that space surprisingly well because it still allows them to maintain psychological control. They can open up selectively, they can disappear when overwhelmed, they can define the pace. But romantic intimacy changes the entire emotional architecture of the connection. Romance introduces expectations they can no longer emotionally sidestep. Now there's accountability. Now there's the possibility of disappointing someone they care about. Now their actions carry emotional consequences beyond the moment. And that's when many avoidants begin unconsciously retreating back into the safety of friendship. This is why so many people end up saying things like, "It already felt like a relationship," because emotionally in many ways it did. The closeness was real, the bond was real, the attachment was real. But for avoidants, emotional closeness without official romantic structure often feels far less threatening than full relational vulnerability. And this is where people get trapped emotionally, because they keep assuming that if someone is emotionally intimate with them, commitment must eventually follow naturally. But avoidants often separate those two experiences internally in ways that deeply confuse the people who love them. At the same time, many avoidants unconsciously use the friend zone as a testing ground. Not always maliciously, not always intentionally, but psychologically they are trying to answer a terrifying question they rarely say out loud: will you still stay if I can't fully give you what you want? So they create relationships filled with emotional closeness while withholding certainty. They want connection, but they also want escape routes. They want loyalty without feeling trapped by obligation. And because of that, they sometimes keep people emotionally close while resisting progression, almost as if they are studying whether love can exist without pressure attached to it. This is why avoidants are often drawn to people who are patient, understanding, emotionally giving, and willing to tolerate ambiguity longer than most people would. Deep down, avoidants are terrified of demands they believe they cannot sustain long-term. So they search for reassurance that love can remain soft, low pressure, and emotionally forgiving. The problem is that over time, this dynamic slowly drains the other person emotionally because they begin sacrificing their own needs in exchange for emotional proximity. They start accepting crumbs because the connection itself feels meaningful. They tell themselves maybe they just need more time, and sometimes avoidants do need time. But sometimes time becomes a hiding place where nobody has to confront the painful reality that emotional attachment alone is not the same thing as emotional readiness. And this is exactly why avoidants send so many mixed signals that make people feel like they're losing their mind, because internally they are often divided against themselves. One part of them genuinely wants closeness, another part fears what closeness will eventually demand from them. So their behavior becomes emotionally inconsistent in ways that feel impossible to interpret logically. They may act jealous when you pull away, but distant when you move closer. They may initiate intimacy, then suddenly go cold afterward. They may speak emotionally like a partner one week and emotionally detach the next. Sometimes they'll even subtly treat you like their person without ever publicly claiming the relationship. They'll prioritize you emotionally, rely on you privately, seek comfort from you during vulnerable moments, yet panic the second the connection starts carrying permanence. And for the person receiving these signals, this creates an emotional addiction cycle because inconsistency intensifies emotional fixation. Your brain keeps searching for patterns, trying to decode which version of them is the real one. Was the warmth real? Was the distance real? Did they mean what they said during vulnerable moments, or were those moments temporary emotional impulses? The painful answer is usually both. Avoidants are not always consciously deceiving people. Many of them are simply emotionally fragmented. They want intimacy and fear intimacy simultaneously, and those opposing forces create behavior that feels contradictory because internally it actually is. To really understand why the friend zone becomes such a common defense mechanism for avoidance, you have to go deeper than dating behavior and look at the emotional blueprint underneath it all. Avoidant attachment rarely appears out of nowhere. Somewhere early in life, emotional closeness became associated with discomfort instead of safety. Maybe vulnerability was dismissed, maybe emotional needs were ignored, maybe independence was praised while emotional dependency felt shameful. Maybe love existed but consistency didn't. Whatever the source, the avoidant nervous system adapts by learning one central survival rule: stay emotionally self-contained. Don't need too much. Don't rely too deeply. Don't become emotionally exposed enough to get hurt. And that rule follows them into adulthood even when they desperately crave connection underneath it. That's the tragedy people often miss. Avoidants are not emotionless. Many of them feel things intensely, but they learn to manage those emotions through distance, suppression, intellectualization, or emotional withdrawal. So when somebody enters their life and begins breaking through those defenses naturally, it creates both attraction and fear at the exact same time. The closer someone gets to seeing the real them, the more emotionally vulnerable they feel. And because vulnerability once felt unsafe, their instinct becomes preserving distance before dependence fully forms. The friend zone, in many cases, becomes an emotional compromise between attachment and protection, close enough to feel connected, distant enough to avoid complete exposure. And ironically, avoidants often romanticize people far more intensely when distance exists between them. Distance allows fantasy to survive. It allows feelings to remain emotionally controlled instead of emotionally lived. This is why some avoidants seem deeply emotionally invested when things are uncertain, unavailable, or undefined, but begin emotionally short-circuiting once real commitment becomes possible. Fantasy feels safer than reality because fantasy doesn't demand sustained vulnerability. In fantasy, they can love without risking engulfment. They can imagine closeness without navigating the actual emotional responsibilities that come with maintaining it. This is why some avoidants appear almost more loving after separation, during periods of distance, or when they believe they might lose someone. Suddenly, the emotional pressure disappears and the feelings rush back to the surface. They miss you intensely once space exists again because distance regulates the fear that intimacy activated. And for the person caught inside this cycle, this can feel devastatingly confusing because it creates the illusion that love only appears when you stop reaching for it. One moment they seem emotionally detached, and the next they are nostalgic, affectionate, emotionally expressive, almost like the walls vanished overnight. But what's really happening is that emotional distance temporarily restores their sense of safety, allowing feelings they previously suppressed to become accessible again. And unless avoidants learn how to experience intimacy without associating it with emotional danger, they often remain trapped in this cycle of wanting closeness most when it feels just slightly out of reach. That's why avoidants will sometimes treat you like a partner in every way except the one way that would actually give you emotional security. They'll check on you every day, they'll notice when your energy changes before anyone else does. They'll emotionally rely on you during hard moments, seek comfort from your presence, and slowly make you part of their inner world in ways that feel deeply intimate. Sometimes they'll even become emotionally exclusive without directly admitting it. The idea of you pulling away unsettles them. The idea of you giving your attention to someone else quietly bothers them, and yet somehow, despite all of this emotional closeness, they still hesitate to fully define what you are to them. This contradiction destroys people emotionally because it creates the feeling of being deeply chosen and deeply rejected at the same time. You start wondering how someone can act like you matter so much while refusing to move the relationship forward. But for avoidance, labels are not just labels. Labels symbolize permanence. They symbolize emotional exposure. Once something becomes official, there's no more hiding behind ambiguity. Now they can fail you. Now they can disappoint you. Now they can lose you in a way that would truly hurt. So instead of moving toward clarity, they often stay suspended in emotional in-between spaces where intimacy exists but certainty does not. And the longer this continues, the more painful it becomes for the other person because human beings are not built to live indefinitely inside emotional almosts. At the center of all this is a fear most avoidants rarely admit even to themselves. The fear of being fully seen, not admired, not desired, seen, because being truly known means someone eventually noticing the parts of them they work hardest to hide, the emotional needs they pretend not to have, the insecurity beneath the independence, the fear beneath the detachment, the loneliness beneath the self-sufficiency. Romance has a way of exposing all of that. Friendship allows a certain level of emotional control, but romantic love demands deeper visibility over time. It reveals attachment wounds, it reveals coping mechanisms, it reveals emotional limitations. And avoidants often carry a silent belief that if someone gets too close, eventually they will either feel trapped or abandoned. So paradoxically, the closer they feel emotionally connected to someone, the more vulnerable and unsafe they can start feeling internally. That's why avoidants sometimes sabotage the exact connections they secretly value most. Not because the feelings are weak, but because the feelings become emotionally destabilizing. And this is the part many people misunderstand completely. The avoidant who friend-zones you while acting deeply attached may actually be more emotionally affected by you than the avoidant who openly commits easily to casual relationships, because casual connections do not threaten their emotional defenses in the same way. Real emotional intimacy does. The stronger the bond becomes, the more their fear system activates. So instead of leaning into the love, they unconsciously try to contain it. And strangely enough, this is exactly why avoidants often friend-zone the person they love the most. Because superficial attraction feels manageable, but deep attachment feels dangerous. When feelings remain light, avoidance can stay emotionally relaxed. But when someone starts becoming emotionally irreplaceable, panic quietly enters the picture. Suddenly there's more at stake, more vulnerability, more potential grief, more emotional dependence, and many avoidants are terrified of needing someone in a way they cannot control. So they create distance to regain emotional balance, even while their feelings continue growing underneath that distance. This is why people often describe avoidance as emotionally contradictory. They may pull away after intimacy instead of moving closer. They may deny feelings while behaving emotionally attached. They may insist on friendship while clearly struggling to emotionally detach from you themselves. And the person on the receiving end often becomes trapped in constant confusion because they can feel the emotional reality beneath the words. They can sense the attachment, they can sense the fear. But sensing someone's feelings and actually receiving secure love from them are two completely different experiences. And that realization is devastating because it forces you to confront something painful. Love alone does not automatically create emotional capacity. Someone can feel deeply for you and still lack the ability to sustain healthy closeness consistently. That's one of the hardest truths people learn in avoidant dynamics because it challenges the fantasy that strong feelings always overcome fear. Sometimes fear wins for years. Timing also plays a much bigger role in these dynamics than people want to admit. Sometimes avoidants genuinely meet the right person while still operating from an emotionally unhealed nervous system. They may care deeply, but internally they are still wired for self-protection more than emotional openness. And until someone becomes consciously aware of their avoidant patterns, they often repeat the same cycle automatically. Closeness feels good at first, attachment grows, vulnerability increases, fear activates, distance follows. Then once space returns, the emotional connection becomes easier to access again. It's a cycle that repeats because the underlying wound never gets addressed directly. And unfortunately, no amount of patience, love, reassurance, or emotional sacrifice from another person can heal attachment wounds for someone unwilling to confront them internally themselves. That's another painful reality people eventually face in these connections. They keep thinking if they just become safer, softer, easier, more understanding, less demanding, then eventually the avoidant will stop pulling